All right, welcome to to Learning Objective 2, where we're going to be discussing the new British policy and the results of that new British policy, which was basically unification of the colonies. Um, According to Parliament, from the beginning of their colonial projects, their empire, they could legally pass or disallow any law they felt was necessary in colonies. But poor communication between England and its colonies meant that the English control was elastic at best. And for all of the reasons, salutary neglect, control over these colonies was a problem. But all that's going to change with the end of the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War after 1763, as we discussed earlier, with England having both time, because the French and the Spanish were out of the equation as far as being rivals, and they had a great financial need to rein in their colonies and to enforce mercantilistic policies in order to make the colonies pay for themselves. The British imperial system lacked effective channels of communication, though, for this to get through. Information about American attitudes came from royal offices in the colonies and others with special interest to protect or advance, or from colonial agents and merchants in London whose information was often out of date because they didn't have text machines back then. Serene in its ignorance, most English leaders insisted that colonials were uncouth and generally inferior beings. The colonial assemblies learned that it was much easier simply to ignore royal instructions instead of trying to fight Parliament's right to make laws. The English and the colonists had never hammered out an agreement on the precise extent of English power over its colonies, which in practice was almost nothing. This is before 1763. Nor had they argued out any differences openly. Instead, they had fallen into a comfortable pattern of sidestepping serious conflicts. English authorities usually looked the other way when colonials violated parliamentary regulations. So, in a sense, trade continued with other empires from the colonies, Spain, French, the Dutch, which was theoretically illegal, but it was never enforced and never really paid attention to. And again, this is all before 1763. The colonists went on quietly breaking the laws, and they could without openly challenging the Parliament's right to pass them. So Parliament would pass laws all it wanted to, and the colonists would just simply ignore them. In 1763, George III appointed this chap down here, George Grenville, to be the new Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is basically like a Secretary of Treasury. Grenville discovered that the American Customs Service was costing the English government nearly £8,000 a year in salaries, but was collecting less than $2,000 in duties. So there was a $6,000 deficit in what was being paid out and what was being collected. Consequently, the English government was losing money on the colonies, even though English businessmen were not, and that's going to be key. So pay attention to that closely. So English businessmen are not losing money, but the government is. So this is going to make it difficult for Parliament to really do anything effective. In order to solve the problem, Grenville began his pursuit of the American dollar in several ways. First, he put several bills, Sugar and the Stamp Act, before Parliament. They were designed to produce revenue by enforcing duties on the American colonists. And what's significant about that is this is the first time that revenue acts, basically taxing colonists directly, is going to be imposed. Second, in April of 1764, he also got Parliament to pass a measure to tighten up customs services to enforce mercantilism. This was done by the use of admiralty courts and writs of assistance. The use of these administrative acts, along with the Sugar Act passed on the same day, are known as the Grenville Acts. The Grenville Acts are the Sugar Act, the Admiralty Courts, and the Currency Acts. And then later comes the Stamp Act of 1765, which we'll discuss. These acts passed after 1763 damaged colonial commercial interests and offended colonial sentiments. After 1763, all conditions for rebellion were at hand except one: a sense of unity among the colonies. And this is what we're basically going to be looking at as in this learning objective. So looking at the Sugar Act, it's notable in that it was passed with the stated purpose of raising revenue, that is, money, taxing. This inaugurated a new phase of British imperial policy. Navigation acts and trade acts included the Wool, Hat, and Molasses Act. They were designed essentially just to protect English commerce from colonial competition and to regulate the flow of trade for the benefit of the British Empire. It was just a way of enforcing the purpose of a colony, right, which was to produce raw material for the purpose of promoting the empire. But here comes the Sugar Acts, and this is basically taxing commodities. First time. The Sugar Act, or the American Revenue Act as it was called in England, was an attempt to raise money to alleviate the larger war debt and the expenses of administrating the colonial empire. Specifically, the Sugar Act imposed new or higher duties on additional imports, including non-British textiles, coffees, and on certain wines. Doubled the duties on foreign goods reshipped in England under the Navigation Acts of 1663 to the colonies, added iron, hides, whale fins, raw silk, etc. To the enumerated lists to be taxed. And finally, the act extended the Molasses Act of 1733, but reduced the 6 cents per gallon duty on foreign molasses to 3 cents. The old rate on sugar was continued, and increased duty was levied on foreign refined sugar. So with all of these new taxes, Grenville was very happy. He estimated the act, if efficiently administered, would return about 45,000 pounds out of the 350,000 needed to administer the American colonies. The Grenville Acts made it clear that the new duties would be enforced by the use of writs or assistants and admiralty courts, thus an end to salutary neglect. And what an admiralty court is, it's basically you are guilty, and if you could prove your innocence, well, it's incumbent upon the accused. So not a good place to be if you've been brought into one of those courts. One of the more important effects of the Grenville Acts was that it greatly damaged the monetary situation in the colonies with the provision enforcement of the Navigation and Trade Acts. The trade with the West Indies was in the colonists' favor and provided a valuable means of income, particularly for New England colonies. Not only had colonial merchants been getting cheap molasses outside the empire, but they found excellent markets for their beef, pork, wheat, flour, and lumber in Spanish, Dutch, and French islands. The profitable rum trade seemed in danger, and John Adams later declared, it is no secret that rum was an essential ingredient of the American Revolution. The net result of the act was that it reduced the amount of money imported to the colonies from foreign West Indies, while at the same time it asked the colonists to pay more money in taxes in the form of hard currency. Furthermore, the Grenville Acts were passed during a sharp economic recession in the colonies, so it was ill-timed. In 1764, the colonists were complaining bitterly about the drop in real estate values, the high price of English manufactured goods, and the scarcity of money and unemployment. English commercial restrictions were blamed for these conditions, obviously, perhaps unjustly, and now the Sugar Act was one of the several burdensome measures aimed at returning colonial prosperity. And the fact that the taxes had to be paid in money was considered a further burden on people already suffering from a lack of money. So 12 days after the passage of the Sugar Act, the Currency Act was passed. This is also part of the Grenville Acts, as they were collectively known, the Sugar Act, the Admiralty Courts, and the Currency Acts. The Currency Act widened the scope of colonial opposition. So it was aimed principally at Virginia, which had issued 250,000 pounds of legal tender paper money during the French and Indian War. The act prohibited, after September 1st, issues of legal tender currency in all American colonies. So to guard against evasion, the act nullified the acts of colonial assemblies contrary to its terms and provided a fine of £1,000 and dismissal from office of any colonial governor who assented to legislature acts in defiance of the law. So if he ran on trying to undo the Currency Act or the Sugar Act or the Admiralty Courts, if they ran on that campaign, then they even if they were elected, they would be removed from office. This act served to create a common grievance uniting the more commercial northern colonies with the agricultural southern colonies. And not only was the Currency Act a severe deflationary measure, but it also threatened to destabilize the colonial economy. So the Grenville Acts raised important economic questions, but more significantly, they started the development of important lines of communication and caused the colonists to examine their constitutional and political relationship with the mother country more closely than ever before. So the Grenville measures were protested at a Boston town meeting in May of 1764, where James Otis first introduced the issue. He didn't utter this phrase, but the issue of taxation without representation, and he also suggested a united colonial response. Now, just keep in mind, that would have been a very radical thing to announce in as early as 1764 at this time. Nobody's talking about forming a country, declaring independence, but James Otis is pushing the measure at this time. 3 weeks later, the Massachusetts House of Representatives organized a committee of correspondence to communicate with the other 12 colonies and suggest the idea of a non-importation of English goods. At first, the non-importation movement was not too effective, but the passage of the Stamp Act in March of 1765 brought it more support. We'll talk more about that later. Nevertheless, in Boston, New York, and elsewhere, merchants pledged themselves not to buy or use certain British goods. It was in this way that the idea of non-importation or a boycott, which was to become a very effective colonial weapon, originated. This is where it first starts, and it will continue and get great effects. In November of 1766, as a result of the success of the non-importation movement during the Stamp Act crisis, Parliament revised the Grenville Acts of 1764. Parliament dropped all duties under the Sugar Act of 1764, except the tax on molasses, which was lowered to 1 cent per gallon, and on all imported molasses. Why did the English repeal all the taxes and leave just the 1 cent gallon on taxes and molasses? Mainly to save face. But why did they do this in the first place? Because people were losing money. English businessmen were losing money, and basically the function of government is to make sure the business community is staying afloat. And so even though this first boycott wasn't as effective as the organizers hoped it would be, it was effective enough. So the significance of the Grenville Acts and the response to it was that it led to the first links of communication and patterns of defense between the colonies after 1763. The links of communication eventually led to independence under this political unification that was taking place. So the colonists learned by their actions during the Grenville Acts, as well as the Stamp Act, that they would have more success if they combined their efforts to defeat their common enemy. This started a pattern of communication and defense, which culminated in the Second Continental Congress in 1775. So as each law is passed, each series of laws that are passed, more boycotts would happen, and eventually this line of communication and of organization and of cooperation would lead to the Second Continental Congress, which would lead to the Declaration of Independence, which would lead to the Articles of Confederation, and eventually lead to the Constitution. The Stamp Act of 1765, when Grenville announced the Sugar Act, he had served notice that yet another revenue measure was in store for the colonists. What was in store was the Stamp Act, which was passed by Parliament in March of 1765. The Stamp Act was a device used in England since 1694. The Act imposed a stamp duty on newspapers, pamphlets, legal documents, cards, and dice. Grenville expected the Act to bring in about £60,000 a year. Grenville regarded all these measures as reasonable and just. He was simply asking the colonists to pay their fair share for colonial defense, with a tax that was much lighter than the one levied in England. However, the law pinched colonial pocketbooks and menaced the local liberties they had come to assume as a matter of right because of salutary neglect. So every time the colonists wanted to buy commercial or legal document, a newspaper, pamphlet, playing cards, or dice, this new act required that they purchase a stamp ranging in value from a half penny to £10. So for example, 3 shillings was a day's wage for an urban worker. The stamp tax was 2 shillings for an advertisement in a newspaper, 5 shillings for a will, and 20 shillings for a license to sell liquor. So this was one of the taxes that was relatively pretty high for at least the common worker. Violators were punished by heavy fines and could be tried in the admiralty courts, where they were assumed guilty if they were just showing up there. No measure could have been better calculated to arouse public opposition or to unify the colonies around a single issue than the Stamp Act. The Sugar Act had struck only at merchants and those associated with them, but the Stamp Act affected every articulate and influential person in the colonies: lawyers, printers, editors, tavern owners. As well as affecting them, it also affects your average working Joe, too. It's affecting their cards, it's affecting their dice, which is stuff that would be commonly used in taverns and bars, right? And so though the prices are going up on them. So influential people are being affected by this, people with money, people with power, and people, what we would call today blue-collar workers, are being affected because they're having to pay higher prices for things that they didn't have to pay so much money for, since the tax is being passed on to them as consumers. And so it became very easy for influential people like Sam Adams to influence people like Paul Revere, who Paul Revere would have been, it was an artisan, a working class person, to get involved in the eventual revolution. So the colonists' reaction to the Stamp Act was violent, to say the least. In voicing their opinions on the act, the colonists did not confine themselves to polite protests. In May, Patrick Henry made a stormy speech in the Virginia House of Burgesses, in which he warned George III to note the fates of Julius Caesar, who was assassinated, and Charles I, two notable tyrants. Henry's Virginia resolves might have remained a local matter had it not been for the colonial press. Newspapers throughout the colonies printed Henry's resolutions, but perhaps because editors did not really know what had happened in Williamsburg, they reported that all 5 resolutions, only 4 had received the Burgesses' full support. Several newspapers carried out resolves that Henry had not even introduced. Hence, it appeared that Virginia had taken a very radical stand on Parliament's right of internal taxation. In response, Massachusetts, in response to the Stamp Act, Massachusetts sent out a circular letter in June to other colonial assemblies proposing an intercolonial Congress to meet in New York City in October to coordinate colonial opposition to the Stamp Act. This became known as the Stamp Act Congress. 9 colonies sent representatives to the Stamp Act Congress, which was the first intercolonial gathering held since the Albany Congress of 1754. The first thing the Congress did was to draw up protests to the Stamp Act. It was entitled the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. The document acknowledged the colonists' allegiance to the Crown. The colonists claimed their rights as Englishmen, freedom and taxation, except with consent. And it's important to understand, to know at this point, Congress didn't threaten rebellion or mention no prospect for independence. To put force behind the Declaration, the Congress suggested that the non-importation movement be supported until the Stamp Act and the Acts of 1764 were revised. The suggestion was carried out, beginning with New York. Merchants and major ports signed agreements not to buy English goods. The decline in British exports declined by 300,000 pounds from the end of 1764 to the summer of 1765. It spoke more forcefully than the colonial resolutions. During the summer, resistance to the Stamp Act soon spread from the assemblies to the streets, and respectable men became agitators throughout the colonies. They set up underground intercolonial organizations known as the Sons of Liberty for the purpose of resisting the Stamp Act. The idea of the Sons of Liberty originated in Boston under the leadership of Sam Adams, which we'll talk about in a later lecture in more detail, and spread rapidly to 12 of the 13 colonies. And like previous boycotts, this boycott was no exception. It hit hard on the English businessmen back on the island back home across the pond. And so eventually this act had to be repealed to a degree. Although Parliament did pass the Declaratory Act, which was basically an act saying that, yeah, we are rescinding the Stamp Act, but keep in mind we have the ability to tax you whenever we want. So it was a saving face measure, basically.